So one of the things that I think restoring ourselves to wholeness is essentially sacred medicine. It's mystical medicine. It's what we need at this time. And if we think about the healing that's needed, we think about the state of the world and what's going on in the world, that sense of separation, fragmentation and degradation. Well, actually, I mean, the separation's an illusion because we're all interconnected. But nonetheless, what's happened is because of our disconnection, our dissociation, we've actually made a bit of a mess of it. But it's retrievable and it's able to be restored because we are capable of connecting in this interconnected world. So a little bit of my story tonight is going to be trying to pull some threads together to look at where those hopeful threads may lie and what we may weave if we took the trouble and the time just to work with this opportunity. And it is an opportunity for the reasons I'm going to outline tonight. But I just want to draw a little bit of first of all, a little bit of inspiration from the Hopi Indians call the time that we're living in a time of the great purification. And there's something really apt about purification. It doesn't mean to say we're all rotten, miserable people that are so degraded that we need to freshen up. It's actually what we're here to do. We're in this earth school to improve ourselves, to improve our relationships, to grow spiritually. That's why we're here. And I think in Matthew 24, Jesus relates the times of natural disasters. So if we're looking at prophetic sort of trajectories, he sees these times of natural disasters as of birth pangs. And when I read that, when I read birth pang, I've obviously never given birth, not in this incarnation, but I've been around when my daughter was born. I didn't see my grandchildren being born, but I was pretty close. Yeah, it's a big process, and I'm sure we'd all agree to that. But this idea that birth pangs, something's being born, something is being renewed, something is being reconstituted in who we are as human beings. So there's the prophetic kind of call, if you wish. And Allan Kardec, there's work with the work that Kardec's done with spirits. And again, this time is deemed to be one of growth and that type of prophetic potential. You'll see it with Peter Duinov as well, talking about what can be achieved, this great mystic from Bulgaria. If any of you have come across his work, David Lorimer's written about, he's one of the program directors of the Scientific and Medical Network. Get a good plug in for David there. Read his book on Peter Duinov. It's really timely for this era that we're living in. So, when, as a creative and as somebody that likes words and who's into the imagination and into the imaginal, when I think of Jesus talking about birth pangs, the first thing I think is contraction and expansion. You know, these are the sort of forces of birth that are happening. Like I said, I haven't been through that in this incarnation, but I probably have in previous incarnations, like most of us. But what is the contraction that's trying to happen in the psyche at this time? And the way I've kind of looked at it in this book here is to look at the moral conscience. Because if you actually think about the time that we're living in, with war, degradation, famine, pollution, corruption, there's so much going on, and there needs to be a moral contraction. The moral contraction brings us into a relationship with what we're really about and what's really going on. The expansion then is a more opening experience. When we work with that moral conscience, the expansion brings us into a mystical consciousness. Something then begins to open up when we take this seriously. So the idea then is that these processes of a contraction and expansion, they bring us into encounter. But what is it we're encountering? Well, you've got to go back to Jung. And his whole, forget about Jung, the psychiatrist and the psychologist. He said, my work is about bringing people to an experience of the Numinous. That's the encounter, the divine spark that sits in everything. The blade of grass, the poppy, you, the animals, everything. The Numinous is the sort of foundation, mystical foundation for what we are and who we are This is our true relationship to life. So one of the things you'll get with, if you read Rudolf Otto, who wrote The Idea of the Holy, he saw the numinous as holy other, meaning nobody owns it. It's not that remote from us, it's part of us. Nobody owns this, but it's a shared communion. It's our collective, all life's communion. And he used two words. He called it, so getting back to the mysticism, the mysterium tremendum and the mysterium fascinans. The tremendum, think ominous, think dread. So when mystics have their encounters with the numinous, it's often with shaking. Think about the Quakers. This is not something that you just go skipping into in a sort of a way, oh, just going to go and have a numinous experience. I mean, it is something that is dreadful at times, ominous. And the fascinans is something which you can now reach across as awe, as luminous, as enlightened, and much more expansive in that sense. So something about these, again, we've got the contraction and expansion, we've got the dread and we've got the awe, we've got the ominous and the luminous. So you can see these dual processes. I'm not into dualism, but you can see the way these forces are acting, a bit like the ego and the ego and the self in Jung's work. That's a necessary dialectic. It's a necessary encounter. So if we start to look then at this process of the numinous awakening, this divine spark in us that we see in all things, then we got this kind of agreement, if we start to go into these experiences, not just intellectually but experientially, that all life is holy. Then what is holy then? How do we contact that? What's our way into the holy? Because I'm in these London streets and it's busy. How do I contact that? Well, we just had a conversation with Lena about synchronicities literally just a couple of minutes ago. They are already present. We know from Wolfgang Pauli's work with Carl Jung, this is primed. This is what we're about. Synchronicities are not some wow. They're reality. This is what we're dealing with. Dreams. And I'll be showing some dreams tonight and sharing ideas about dreams. We can see them as from the personal unconscious, and they might just have a personal message for us, or we can see that they come a much more archetypal element from the collective unconscious, and we can actually see that we get spirit messages, angelic guidance, and all manner of stuff in our dreams, right? They're not one thing, they're lots of things. So already that's a very powerful injunction to pay attention to our dreams and experiences. Last night, I had an electric shock run through my foot, and I kept getting a child's face appearing to me. I said, I don't know who you are. I haven't got time tonight to deal with this, but we'll meet again. Right? I took it seriously, and I'm not joking. I know it puts a smile, but I did. I was just trying to get to sleep, and electric current up my foot, and I thought, right, who is this little boy? Who is this? I don't know, but I might need to make some space for that work. I'm willing to do that. Not because he needs my help, but he might help me, I mean, this is how it works. We were talking about the daemon, Jung's idea of the daemon. In my second book, The Visionary Spirit, I write about daemonic fate, that we have to meet these forces. They are encounters, but when we meet them and when we really contact what the challenges are through our dreams, our altered states and what have you, it leads us to an angelic destiny. So there's a daemonic fate, angelic destiny. I write a little bit about that in this book. So these are really powerful forces. These are the contractions and the expansions. Okay, so I don't think this is just a linear, I'll just go off and do my work. We might find ourselves getting flayed, opened up, and all manner of things happening to us, which are productive for us in the grand scheme of things. So I just want to tell a little story about a dream. I might cry, but that's okay. If you want to come up and hug me when I'm crying, that's fine. But I'm not falling to bits. I'm an emotional being. Let's see how it goes. I was reading the newspaper, as is my wont, and my jaw dropped open. It was just before I wrote this book, and I do believe the library angels were helping me because I needed a good story. And Julie, it happened. Samira was in the newspaper. She was a woman whose son had been murdered. You may recognize the story. Had been murdered by her son's friend. And it was a shocking story. He then was duly caught and was sentenced to death. she was happy that she was going to get some kind of justice. But the story's got a twist, because justice isn't about retribution. It's about restoration. If you think about restorative justice, it brings us into a different conversation rather than you're going to get hammered for doing X, Y, and Z. So she was thinking, right, he's going to get hung. And on the way, she started having dreams of her son saying, forgive him. Forgive him. And they were recurrent dreams. Now, Jung would have loved these, because recurrent dreams are happening recurrently because you're not getting the message and there's a point that needs to be picked up. And on the last dream, on the eve of this man being hung for murder, her son appeared. This is the bit that gets me. And he stood there. He didn't say anything. So, if you want a contraction of the moral conscience, there it is. There's now no words. This is an amplification, according to Jung. Now the dream is amplifying the message because the consciousness, ego consciousness of Samira, isn't getting it. So the son, now the wisdom of the dreaming is beyond me sometimes. In the dream sequence, the son is giving a message, forgive him, forgive him, forgive him. And then he just stands there. He's now directly appealing to her unconscious, her consciousness, to wake up to what she's colluding with, which is revenge and retribution. She woke up and told her husband what the dream was. It always gets me, that dream. Gosh. And the husband said, hand it over to God. See what God says. So now we've gone from this contraction of the moral conscience now to opening up to a mystical consciousness, because now we don't know what's going to happen, right? When the moral conscience gets cooked, we've got a good idea about what the work is. When you get into the mystical consciousness, hold on to your hats, right? So she duly did that because she was a religious woman. The next day, as the young man was getting the noose put around his neck and passages of the holy book being read out, and he was preparing to die, she had this impulse to run onto the scaffolding and slap him round the face, and, as is true of that country, had the right as a mother to forgive her son's murderer, which she did, right? And she said, I don't know why I did it. That's mystical consciousness. She prayed to God, she asked for help, and duly she was given it. The impulse to forgive was overwhelming. She said, I feel such peace. The young man was then given a life sentence, which he had the life then to reflect. And that's not wasted time. We know people at mystics and hermits that, you know, I mean, he's going to be fed for a good few years, and I suspect he would use that time wisely. The son's mother, who was then reprieved from the hanging, got on the stage, and they hugged together, and this story went all around the world, touched the hearts of thousands of people. It was on news outlets, newspapers, and so much that just touched so many people. I cried my eyes out when I read that story. I couldn't believe it. I thought, this is what we're in. The moral conscience meeting this opportunity to say, I'll hand that over to something bigger than... Maybe the message for us reading that story is, maybe I could then actively take a part in, you know, creating forgiveness for that person. Hers was at the last minute because, you know, he was in the noose. So, essentially what I'm saying is that implicit in that story is some shadow work. And you know Jung's work. The shadow is being worked with. When she's meeting her son, saying forgive him, and the amplification of no words, there's the opportunity for atonement. Now, I know a lot of people don't like that word, but atoning is quite like, you know, I feel remorseful, or I want to try and reach into a different level of consciousness. Shadow work leads then, when we're working with it, to some sacred work, and that brings an opportunity for at-one-ment. You know, I love that that play on words, atonement and at-one-ment, you know. So there's something wonderful about that. And for me, what happens in this work, which I think I like pairs, I like contraction and expansion. I think what we're also looking at is vectors and vibrations. If we can work intentionally, and I wrote quite a lot about intention in '98 in an academic paper that I published. And for some reason, it just felt so right to get on that and intentionality around our spiritual path. And, you know, all these years later, it's still true. I feel this is a real pivotal piece of work that we have to do around intentionality. So the vectors that we're engaging, vectors mean these lines, a vector of transmission, for instance, between two cells or a virus, there's a vector transmission. Something is directional, can be intentional as well. But as in the case of Samira, that vector of her working with those dreams, albeit reluctantly, and her husband saying, hand it over to God, turn to God, which she did, a vibration started to happen which was way off a vector. The vibrations are working on a totally different frequency and bringing more in. And in fact, when she occupied that space, she just was overwhelmed with the urge to forgive him. It wasn't a conscious decision. She wasn't sitting there, will I, won't I? It just came over her. That's the spirit at work. That's being open to what I'd call that mystical consciousness. But it came through this moral conscience, this real dilemma. So for me, the spiritual path is that. It's these forces at work in us, vibrations and vectors. I was very lucky many years ago, after in the midst of a spiritual emergency, I left a Buddhist monastery I'd lived in for 3 years. I went to live in '87 in Norwich, and I was trying to recover. I was on the dole. I kept walking past this house with this picture of a little Chinese man who looked like a Taoist sage with a wispy beard. And I thought, I wonder who lives there. And I wasn't really wanting to get in touch with people. I just wanted to be on my own and work through what was a very difficult process. And then one day I went into a bookstore to order Thomas Cleary's The Taoist I Ching that had just come out in '87. And the guy standing behind me, I just ordered the book, and he gasped and said, I'm ordering that too. Can you imagine that as a synchronicity? Two people in '87 ordering the same book at the same time in a random bookshop in the same city. It's, you know, it's quite a rare one, that, I think. Anyway, he said, we must go for tea. And I said, right. So he took me back to his house, and it was the picture of the wispy man in it. I thought, okay, that was ready to happen. Anyway, he, his name was Upakas Wenshu. He was part of a lineage around a great Buddhist patriarch called Shu Yun. And Shu Yun died at 120 in the 19th century. His successor, Charles Look, was Richard, the guy I met in the bookshop. So he was on that lineage, and Charles Look was his teacher. So the story I'm going to tell you, for me, is very personal, because Richard, who told me the story and gave me the book, knew this lineage intimately. So I have it from very strong, evidence, if you wish, about the transmission of this story. In time of the Cultural Revolution, Shu Yun was reviving Buddhism and Buddhist monasteries in China, because there had been a time of degradation and people weren't interested. And he was a great mystic and a great monk. And a bunch of thugs came and took over the monastery, and they treated him absolutely appallingly, to the point where they beating him with sticks. He was 112 at the time, beating him with sticks and iron bars and kicking him. They wouldn't let him go to the toilet. They didn't feed him. And this was going on for a long time. I mean, you imagine, I wouldn't want that at my age, let alone 112. And they beat him so ferociously, he went into another state. Now, nobody makes the correlation there, but to me, it sounded like a near-death experience, because he ended up leaving his body, and he went to the Tushita heavens, where he met Maitreya Buddha. Maitreya was giving teachings in this beautiful, ornate place, and he was giving teachings to all these wonderful monks and nuns, and all of a sudden he stopped his teaching, and he looked at Shu Yun, and he said, come here, you. He said, go back, you have some karma to work out. And Shu Yun didn't want to go. He was quite happy with staying with Maitreya Buddha. And this is very typical of near-death experiences, by the way, if you've studied them. So he ended up going back, and everyone was amazed that he survived. But as he revived, officials have been sent from Beijing to start to deal with the culprits that had actually beaten this very well-loved monk at 112 years old. Despite the officials not being into Buddhism, because it was a communist state, they understood this was a venerable teacher. And his clearing up his karma, which Maitreya said, you need to go back, clear up your karma, and he said they had nothing to do with it. Nothing happened with them. He forgave them. This is very typical, and I write a few stories in there, good examples from the Dalai Lama, Jewish mysticism, Sufism, Hinduism, stories of people that have actually done that level of forgiveness with the most degrading things that have happened to them. Xu Jung understood that forgiveness was the only option here, because when you Pema Chodron wrote a book called The Wisdom of No Escape. If you think, well, hang on a minute, let's just forget the karma for a minute, I just want to go back and sort those people out for what they did to me, well, you're just perpetuating more of your own karma. It's better to probably take it on the chin and see if you can work for a better resolution with the people that are, you know, in the frame, as it were. So what he did was he forgave them. And like I said, I think Pema Chodron's book, you probably get it in here actually, it might be worth having a look at that, The Wisdom of No Escape. There's no way out of this. There's no easy path out of this. We've got to face it. You know, we've got to face what we're in psychically and what we're in terms of our own evolution spiritually. And that's soul work. That's what I call soul progression. As there's no way around it but to say, when you look at near-death experiences, there's a very powerful injunction that you get from them, and they're pretty consistent. If you look at the life reviews of near-death experiences, when people have life reviews, this always fascinates me. I've never been able to square this one, but when people have a life review, they are looking panoramically at almost like a video or something of their own life, but they feel the consequences. And someone in the room may well have had one of these experiences, so forgive me, I haven't, but I you know, if you have, then great, you can talk about it afterwards with us. The idea is that they then feel the consequences of the actions that they committed on others. Now, what I find interesting about that is if, for instance, I did something bad to someone and then I get on with my life and I never see that person again, I don't know how they experience what I did to them or what happened. But when you have a near-death experience, that's what you see. Now, where's that recorded? Where's that information held? Well, the only way I can square that one up is the Akashic records, and that something is being held in a bigger intelligence than what we think we know. It's beyond that level of comprehension. And I think that's what we're dealing with here. So when we're looking at this contraction and expansion, bear that in mind. Here's my little 2 bobs worth. We're co-creating from our thoughts, feelings and actions. We're co-creating the world, for better or worse, with everything we do, think and feel. You start to see you are magnetizing something. And let's be honest, fair cop, you know, I'm not sitting here talking from a place of perfection. I'm definitely a work in progress. But I'm doing the work, and that's what I'm talking about tonight. So it's not, you know, not coming from a place of, you know, I've seen the light and done it. I haven't, but I'm doing it. I'm trying. And one might look at that and say, oh yeah, well that's just the karmic sort of journey that we're on. For me, it becomes I like karma, that word, because I think karma is an opportunity. That's why we're here in Earth School, to learn. I came up with the term divine democracy, because I think this intelligence is so vast and incredible, but it's incredibly democratic. Because if you look at your actions, and there's no judgment when you're shown in your near-death, if people had near-death experience, there's no judgment about what you did. It's just shown to you for your own learning and edification. It's so incredible. There's no kind of nasty stuff that goes with it. And so people then think, right, I've got the opportunity here. And so people come back from those types of experiences and make radical changes. I've worked in the field of behavior change for many years, and trust me, sometimes you're trying to work with people and say, well, look, come on, let's go. It can take a long time because, you know, people are working through difficult things. But when you have a near-death experience, people come back, there's a lot of adjustment and there's a lot of time to get over that experience, and often social ostracization because people are scared. But once people get the message, then they actually work with that really powerfully. If you have ever read a book, My Descent into Death by Howard Storm, I highly recommend it. It's one of the most mind-blowing books I've read, you know, so beautifully written. In a nutshell, I'll tell it to you. He goes, he's an atheist, he doesn't really, not too bothered about people, not too bothered about anything, you know, he's got tenure as a professor, great, life's going well, has a perforated duodenum, ends up having a near-death experience, and but interestingly, because his state of consciousness was in a place of, you know, not in a good place really, he was, where he went to after his near-death experience was a place of, it wasn't very nice, because that's where he was at, and there were others there that weren't very nice who attacked him, and in a fit of you know, fear, he cried out, "Jesus, save me." And this being of light came down, scooped him up, and he's blubbing like a baby. And he then basically saw his life review, came back, and pretty quickly changed, and he's a church pastor. I believe he's a pastor in the church. So that's the kind of change we're talking about. People don't forget stuff like this. This is like real. And so for me, hell isn't a place that exists. It's a state of mind. It's a state of mind, you know. You can be in your own living hell all the time, or you can work on yourself and create the conditions for a much more heavenly existence. And that's really what we're talking about in this contraction and expansion. So Allan Kardec was told by a spirit beautifully, this sums it up to me almost like without anything. If you want a good way to look at this, when we're in spirit, we don't have clothes. What we wear is what our thought forms were when we're in the earth realm. So he said, he was told, the robes we weave in this life are the ones we wear in the next. So that's a really powerful story. If you want a real wake up around that. And I remember reading Helen Greaves' Testimony of Light, another cracker from the 60s. If you've not read that, honestly, get it. That is a book and a half. Her friend, I've forgotten her name now, but she was a former nun for 20 years, and then she stopped being a nun, and Helen Greaves is psychic. Stopped being, I can't remember her name. She stopped being a nun, but she then got cancer and died. But then in spirit, she started liaising with Helen and telling her about her experience. She said, "You must write this down as a book." And what she said, I love triangulation, and even though it comes from weird sources, triangulation is where I read in Kardec, the robes you wear in this world are the ones you wear in the next. And she said, "You'll never believe it, but everybody's just wearing what thought forms they were on Earth." And I thought, wow. So when I read that and then I read Kardec, I thought, right, we've got some work to do here. So, you know, powerful stuff. The robes you weave in this life are the ones you wear in the next. You know, it's a great leveler. It really wakes you up. So, do we have a choice around this work? Is it choice or is it choiceless? Are we willfully ignorant or are we willfully engaged in this work? That's, each of us has to find that in our own journey as we go forward. But to me, it sums up, everything I've said so far sums up the idea of soul progression. Soul progression as spiritual emancipation. That's the journey. And I'll give you a good story about that. We often go to the East and think about some of these wonderful mystics we hear about. I mean, I've read them, you probably have too. And Tibetan monks, you know, that run at vast speeds across the Tibetan plateaus, who disappear and do all these wonderful things. I lived in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery for 3 years, and it was always wonderful, you know. And I believe those stories. And why not? Because these are, you know, feats or cities that are beyond the everyday meat body experience. But what was great, and you're from Greece, Lena, I read and discovered through reading a Christian saint in the Orthodox tradition called Saint Paisius. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
Yeah,
and he's quite an amazing person. And I started just before I was getting this published, I get obsessions with things. I started ordering books from these monasteries and getting them sent over, and it's stories of some of the elders of that tradition. And what I discovered in reading Elder Paisios is that there are these what are called the mystical elders or the invisible elders of Mount Athos in Greece. And have you heard of them?
Yeah, he was a visionary person. So
Yes.
He did a lot of prophecy.
That's right.
Yeah,
yes.
He gave his own versions of like history that many people in Greece believe in.
Yes. But a truly incredible person, Elder Paisios. But he said, I meet every 4 or 5 years with these invisible elders. And he said, and I started to get, this is interesting now, what is going on here? And then I started to find the stories. And I'll tell you 2 of them because I think they're interesting. One of them was a young man called Ianos, and I think that's how you pronounce it in Greek. Ianos, yeah. And he wanted to become a hermit. And in Mount Athos, being a hermit's a serious business. It's if you look it up online, they build little shacks on the edge of a cliff and got the Aegean blowing in your face. It's not an easy thing to do. But he was preparing himself, and he had a mentor with him. And one night, he's up all night praying in this narthex in the church. In walks a naked man with long hair and a beard down here, just a loincloth on. He came in and blessed all the icons, and then walked out. And this guy was so intrigued. This was like this being was light as well, just an incredible. He started walking up the hill, and this young man jumped in front of him and said, "Will you be my elder? Will you teach me what I need to know?" And he said, "You couldn't be an elder because you can only live where I live by grace." So something about grace comes into this. Something about in this mystical opening, something comes to us which is not of us, but of which we are. We live there by grace alone. And he said, more importantly, he said, prepare yourself because in 2 weeks you'll be dead. And this young man, he's only 19, very perplexed, but he took it seriously. These beings, by the way, disappear and appear. They disappear and turn up in weird places. So he went back to his elder and he said, I've just been told by this guy in a loincloth and long hair that I'm going to die in 2 weeks. And they said, oh, wow, what a blessing. So let's get you prepared. So, reaching a ripe old age doesn't necessarily mean to be spiritually fulfilled. His time was ready. So basically, they got him prepared. And when he died, the smell of beautiful violets or whatever was coming, it was a very spiritual thing. So clearly it was a prophecy of your time is ready. Another one was an atheist who was walking on the beach. He loved to go to Athos because of the natural beauty. It's a wilderness. And this atheist was walking along the beach, and all of a sudden he saw at vast speeds this naked man running towards him with long hair blowing over it, saying, Tryphanos, Tryphanos. That's his name. He said, amazing. He said, I've just seen God. And he thought, how do you know my name? And he disappeared before his eyes. Now, I don't know what happened to his atheism after that, but, we can safely say he would have been fairly challenged by that experience. These are all accounts that have been verified because they were told to people who are trusted in that lineage. And there are more stories like that, and I just love them. But Elder Paisios said something. He said, I meet with these elders every 4 to 5 years, and he said, but let me tell you, they're not interested in glory for their own edification or their own whatever. There's nothing about that would interest them. Their whole reason for existing is to pray for the world. To pray for the world. And I thought, wow, so this is a grace-given experience that leads to a prayerfulness for the state of the world. And he said, and trust me, there are people beyond that are even more enlightened. So this isn't the end of it, And if you read Kardec, you'll get exactly the same trajectory. You'll see spirits that are very higher order spirits. And there's a sense of you can only function at the vibration of which you're at. You can't go further than the vibration that you're at. So there's some good reason to do some spiritual practice in the earth realm. Why not? So I've talked about Howard Storm. Basically, I just want to say one little thing about the Numinous, because we've been schooled in an individualistic consciousness, the cult of individualism, I call it in the Restorative Spirit. We've been sort of educated in that way. Our society's set up that way, and that's what we always make sure we're okay. Then I might do a little bit of something. I think it's going to have to be the other way around. Whatever shift is happening in the collective at this time, it won't be anything like what we think it's going to be. It's going to be radical. I don't think carbon offsetting and just, you know, getting your carbon down is going to just cut it. Yes, we got to do these things, but at the same time, I think we need truly a mystical awakening, a wild, open-hearted, moral constriction and a mystical expansion to start to get the shift happening. Then it will form with grace and guidance in a way that if we're tuned into it and we care for the collective, it will begin to happen in a good way. I think that's my intuition, my gut feeling about it. So if I was to leave you with one thought about this, Michael Washburn is a transpersonal philosopher, and he's wrote 3 brilliant books, a great devotee of Jung and other people like that. So kind of like, you know, I've got a bias towards him. So, but he used these words once, and I remember thinking, I love these, and I always like crediting people for their work. I always think, don't be dishonest and nick it for yourself. So Michael Washburn, look him up. He talked about people as being numinous attractors. Numinous attractors. So if you think about that, the divine spark is in everything, and that's in us, in all of us, you, me, animals, blades of grass. There's the divine spark in everything. As Howard Storm was told, everything is holy, treat it well. Numinous attractors, if we work on that basis, that that's our true identity, this is what we really are about, then who knows what synchronicities, dreams, visions, and all manner of things will come to us that will enable us to trust that. And then our job, I believe, is to raise our collective vibration in line with that. So, you know, that's a path of love, mercy, generosity, gratitude, forgiveness, and all those things. It's a path of service, not self-service. You know, yeah, okay, of course we like to make sure we got enough to eat. Yes, nothing wrong with that. But I'm talking about this bigger picture, this mystical shift that's going to be part of, as I come back to the beginning of the talk, restoring ourselves to wholeness is sacred medicine. Numinous attractors, what will it take to magnetize that between us and within us and around us, and all the different ways that we could live? Well, anyway, so thank you for listening to that, and you know, I didn't want too much. Thank you. Yeah, and who knows, I might not be able to answer it, but somebody in the room might. You know, that's the way I like to work. It could be anyone here that's got the wisdom. So, you know, but if it's something to do with that talk, and I might be able to field that, great. Yeah.
Sorry, I might have missed this, so forgive me. But could you explain what you mean by moral contraction?
Yeah, so a lovely story that I'm reminded of is Jung told a story about a businessman who he worked with. It's a very light story, this, but I think it illustrates the point. And this guy was involved in a business transaction with someone, and the more he got involved in the business transaction, he was aware that things weren't wholly right. So he had a dream of his hands being covered in dirt. And you see, I think a moral contraction is actually not always a conscious one. It can be an unconscious one. So I think it's a good question, and I think it's the right one, because he went to Jung with his dirty hands, and Jung said, well, what are you involved with that needs cleaning up, in a nutshell? And straight away he just got out of that business. And so, or he could have carried on and think, well, actually, this could be really good for me, because I'll end up getting a lot of money, I'll get a lot of prestige. You know, there's a moral, so the contraction is, it brings you into a point where you've got to make a decision. You know, like Samira could have just went, kill him, hang him. But her unconscious was already saying, no, don't. You know, whether that was her spirit, son coming in spirit, whether it was her own unconscious telling her, I could have been all of that actually. But try to think of the constriction as something that's bringing you to an encounter at the first base of, you know, it troubles you. So you're in trouble with something and you can't find a rational way through. But somehow by engaging with it, you end up getting an expansion. Something comes off that. Yeah? Should we? Yeah? I don't know. There's 2 of you there. I'll let you. Okay.
What does the word humanist?
Well, Rudolf Otto, who's a theologian, he went around the world looking at theistic, polytheistic, shamanistic cultures, and what he saw in common was that there was some level of other, some divine other, that what he means by other is not your ego, something bigger, transpersonal we could call it. And the Numinous, where it comes from is actually Latin. The Numen in the old Latin tradition was you doffed your cap to the emperor. That's the Numen. Yeah. So the Numinous is a way of coining that, because the Roman emperors were divine, seen as divine. So it's a way of appreciating divinity. He said it's wholly other, it's not your ego, but he said it has two dimensions to it. It's mystical in that it's awesome, powerful, and also quite dreadful. And I'll tell you a little story just to illustrate the point. True story. It's in my first book, The Unselfish Spirit. I used to go to a monastery. I don't go there anymore because they don't accept guests. But I went to this monastery, and there was a monk, somebody who wanted to become a monk. He was all in white, and he wasn't a monk there. He was trying to get to become a monk. And so I was having on retreat, and there was a day on Sunday when we could speak. And I said, "What's your story? Why are you here?" And he said, "Well, I served 14 years for bank robbery." I said, "Say more, because these are the people I love to meet." And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Well," he said, "they tried to give me, because I was on good behaviour, they tried to get me out early, but he said, no, I'm going to see the whole 14 years out. I want to do that." He refused to leave prison. Very moral, upright guy, Brother Ralph. He ended up becoming a monk. I might cry on this story as well, because I knew him. He basically was praying because he realised his cell became a place of spirit. So he found his religion again, and he started to pray, and he had an angelic visitation. These happen more often than we give credit for. Our hyper-rational cultures let us down badly on that front. And he was overwhelmed with fear. He was in the corner shaking. He said it was a really powerful experience. It wasn't sweetness and light. It was very frightening. But he realised he had to become a monk. So the story he told me is he went around all these monasteries in England saying, "Look, I've just done 14 years for armed robbery, and I think I want to become a monk." And they all shut the door in his face, apart from the place where I used to go to, Turvey Abbey. And they said, "Come in." The lead monk was a Freudian analyst, and the second in charge was a Jungian analyst, which I thought was very interesting in terms of the ranking. So the abbot said, "Come in." He said, and they used to run group psychotherapy there as well. So it's a really great place. But that's the Numinous. In one level, it's awesome and wow and incredible, and it's frightening. Yeah? So you've encountered something when you meet it.
The presentation, I'm certainly interested in buying your book.
Oh, thank you.
You're very generous with all the other references.
Thank you.
But I would like to say that many of us believe that this is all the time of the Great Awakening.
Yeah.
And we're all being present to the corruption.
Yeah.
In every arena, be it political, financial, environmental, scientific, academic. I mean, I don't want to be too outrageous with what I want to say. But it's very interesting that it's also known as the Kali Yuga, the end of a processional cycle of 26,000 years. And I think it's an amazing, magical time.
Yeah.
I mean, if anyone can't see that now is the right time to do the right thing and make the world a better place, then I've lost an amazing lesson.
I think it's incredible what you're saying, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think we're at the time of the Great Awakening. Here we are. It's happening. I think there's no choice in this. It's going to happen. It's going to amplify. It already is.
Human resonance is off the charts. I don't follow that.
Yeah. Well, not so well, but I've heard of it and aware of it. I'm very sensitive, so I do pick things up and get a little bit vibrational.
Buying your book and you'll see me again.
Bless you. But I just want to say, by the way, thank you for saying that, because one of the things I do say in the book are institutions, because of the hyper-rational approach that hitherto we've taken, and I don't want to blame the institutions because that's what we've all been schooled in and that's all we know, but we've had the transpersonal, for instance, since 1969 and way before that, but officially we've had it since 1969, and really, you know, if you try as an academic to get something in on that level, it's only now it's starting to move. But for many years, you were just, you know, it was quite hard actually. So the judiciary, all of those different institutions are going to have to wake up around this, and each of us plays our part in that vibrationally. So you talk about the
in the common law movement, common law assemblies,
yeah,
and friends
beautiful.
of mine here, I recognise them very politically active and
Yeah.
Socially and community active. It's an amazing time.
Thank you. Thank you.
I did have my finger up. It's the Numa, T-N-E-U-M-A. Numa.
Yeah, well, that's breath, isn't it, in Greek, pneuma.
No.
So it means spirit. Yeah, you've got ruah in Hebrew, ruah, pneuma, spiritus in Latin. You know, all breath, by the way. They all mean breath. Breath means spirit. So, you know, that's a lovely thing. But it's a different spelling from the Numen, which was to N-U-M-E-N, Newman. But as in numinous, it's M-U-N-I-O-U-S. Yeah, that's right. But the Newman as a N-U-M-E-M-E-N is, yeah, so it's kind of little plays on words. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Absolutely. You know, you look at all the mystical traditions, it's all about working in the heart. And I think, I mean, I could say more about that by saying that it's heart work.
That's
You know.
another book.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to write anymore. I'm done. Took me 12 years to do 3. I'm knackered. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so we've got one more here. Is that okay?
Alright. So thank you for your presentation. It was amazing.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering about one thing. And so in your presentation, you mentioned that most of the people that are doing work are doing them themselves, and it blends in their hand, right?
Yeah.
Basically, they're having
Yeah.
the experience or any kind of other positive state of consciousness, and then the solution comes up self-evident. Although you also started mentioning morals, and I'm thinking, what would be your proposal to advise an entire society to greater morals without falling into the trap of belief system?
Yes, or moralizing,
Yes, exactly.
which is this is the trap. You know, if you say, you naughty person, that's not going to work. I mean, one thing I was taught in my therapy training, people never grow if they feel bad about themselves. So let that one go for straight away, you know. I mean, we got to get that. A moral question, I think, is one that's about truth of who we really are, and having, first of all, not just about that's right, that's wrong. That's very binary. It's about truth of who we are. So Samira, in her story, she was in a moral conundrum between she had the power to confirm a death sentence or to release someone. That was an incredible, you know, that story for me was mind-blowing when I read it in the newspaper. So basically, there's a whole conversation to be had. I don't think anyone can advise. I couldn't advise society what to do, but I think we could have bigger conversations. And one of the threads is restorative justice. If you look at restorative justice as distinct from retributive justice, you'll start to see there's a different moral compass working, and you get a different dynamic in the process, because people can say, when you did this to me, this is what happened, and the perpetrator then gets to work on that truth and accountability. Here's the interesting thing. I don't like even the polarization always so rigidly as victim and persecutor, because we've all been persecutors for something. Look at the state of the planet. You know, there are different levels of persecution and different levels of victimhood. But I think we've all been victims and we've all persecuted. So for me, the dynamic would be truth and accountability, like they had in South Africa. But even that was flawed. I think we need to come at this with a view that we have a wider appreciation of the divine and learning from near-death research. This is verified research. This is not fly-by-night. If you read Bruce, oh crumbs, I've forgotten his name.
Grayson.
Grayson, thank you. I was going Gray, but yeah, Bruce Grayson. Wow, that guy's done 40, 50 years worth of high-level research, and skeptics have tried to pull his research to bits, and they have got no grounds for doing so. They said, this is robust research. So I think we can take the vignettes from near-death experiences and extrapolate them into conversations about what a moral conversation would be about how we work with each other and raise each other up to something. So the constrictions are a necessary part of that, but I think the conversation is a bigger part of it as well. So I don't know if that answers your question. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bless you.
Thank you all.